Hello again, dear ones. Welcome to part B of an episode on St Bernard of Clairvaux, in particular the poem attributed to him, Jesu Dulcis Memoria, and the hymns it inspired. Let's listen to a tune associated with these hymns. That tune, by Henry Baler, was originally called Hesperus, but in hymn books today you'll see it called Quebec. We'll take a quick look at the music shortly, but first I'd like to present a quick overview of the long poem. In part A, we had a close look at the short poem, Jesu Dulcis Memoria, the famous extract of the first several stanzas of the longer poem. In this part, let's look at a version of the whole poem and look at what you could call the mystical quality of it. I must emphasize at the outset, this poem is attributed to St Bernard. Possibly some direct quotations of his words or a paraphrase of them are present. But as we saw from his treatise on loving God, this poem is not wholly representative of his style. There seems to have been a beautiful, mysterious aspect to his writings, but St Bernard also discussed scripture very logically. This version of the poem from the Oxford Book of Medieval Verse, edited by F.J.E. Raby, is available on archive.org. It has 42 stanzas, 168 lines. There are apparently other versions of the poem from different manuscripts, and there are small variations between them, including the word order of the opening line. The consensus is pretty solid that this poem was not written by St Bernard directly. This is based on appearances in manuscripts, which are all later than his lifetime, and the attributions vary. So not all of these manuscripts attribute the poem to St Bernard. And it's based on style. St Bernard's style uses a lot of scriptural references, for example, and this poem is what F.J.E. Raby calls highly affective, very emotional, whereas St Bernard himself has a cooler, more detached and scholarly style. However, F.J.E. Raby says it breathes his spirit. St Bernard's own writing is extremely scriptural. On Loving God, every idea is accompanied by a Bible reference. There's a lot of St. Paul, of gospel references, and the Old Testament, a very broad and conventional approach in the good sense of that word. At the same time, personal experience of God is significant in St. Bernard's writing. Writing on the Song of Songs, he refers to the kiss of the loved one, and he links this to the touch of the Holy Spirit, which is like a kiss. This long poem, Dulcis Jesu Memoria, is interesting, and it has some powerful passages. At 168 lines, it would be long for a hymn, but not overly long for a poem. Each stanza is 4 lines with a repetitive and quite strict rhyme structure. Overall, it doesn't really have a thesis or a narrative arc. It's sort of rhapsodic, flowing from image to image and thought to thought, although it does have a clear conclusion. The tone is euphoric. The continuous succession of rhymes or of matching word endings is unusual, and gives it a very chant-like quality. I've seen suggestions that it might have been sung, and it or parts of it have certainly been set to music in Latin over the centuries. I don't know if the imagery is unique as such, but it's certainly unusual. It speaks about a very personal relationship with Jesus. Here are some bits to give a feeling for the longer poem. We've got stanza 8, line 3. Jesum adenter quaerite, quaerendo inadescite. Jesus, passionately seek ye. With seeking, catch a light. So seek Jesus ardently, burn in seeking. And stanza 17, the poet says, whom thy love makes drunk knows what Jesus tastes. A happy taste for whom it satisfies. There is nothing more that he wants. Stanza 25, then embraces, then kisses, which surpass cups of honey. And stanza 28, this love sent from heaven, haeret mihi medulitus, adheres for me to the core, literally to the marrow. It sets my mind on fire completely, hoc delectatur spiritus. With this, it is delighted, the spirit. So the subject follows its verb. In his sermons, St Bernard himself refers to the Holy Spirit as kissing the one who seeks God. So this is all very personal, powerfully emotional, and it's very much like love poetry. St Bernard wrote quite a lot about the Song of Songs in the Bible, which is a love poem, explaining in detail the metaphors of the lover as Jesus. Here's a nice one. Stanza 6, immediately after the text of the short poem for the famous hymn. Jesum quaeram in lectulo. Jesus, I will seek in my little bed. Lectulo, the ulo ending is a diminutive, so little bed, like a monk's cot. Clauso cordis cibuculo. Clauso, so that's the ablative, so that's in the closed of my heart chamber, so like little room, cubicle. Privatum et in populo, privately and in public, quaeram amore sedulo. I will seek love diligently. In bed or in my cot is perhaps an allusion to the Song of Songs, and it does a little bit refer to Christ as the lover, although for St Bernard this is very much a metaphor. You shouldn't read too much into that. And the next stanza, Avec Maria diliculo, with Mary at dawn, Jesum quaerem in tumulo, Jesus I will seek at the tomb, cordis clamore querulo. Of the heart a cry plaintive, mente quaeram, non oculo. With mind I will seek, not with eye. Across these two stanzas, the verb I shall seek is repeated 4 times. I shall seek Jesus on my cot. I shall seek studiously. I shall seek Jesus in the tomb. I shall seek in my mind. And in this stanza, there is some longing and expressions like querulo, lament. There's also sighing. But overall, the poem is ecstatic. Jesus decus angelicum. Jesus, beautiful, angelic, in aure dulce cantium, in ear, sweet song, in ore mirificum, in mouth, honey, miraculous, cordi pigmentum caelicum, for the heart, a hue heavenly, tu mentus delectatio, amorus consumatio, tu mea gloriatio, Jesu mundi salvatio. You, for the mind, a delight of love, a consummation. You, for me, the glory Jesus of the world, salvation. As noted, it does have a conclusion that differs from the rest of the poem. The sort of concluding section is 6 stanzas and begins with Portas vestras atolite, chalicives occurrite, triumphatori dicite, salve Jesu rex inclite. Raise your gates, meet the heavenly host, triumphantly say, Hail Jesus, glorious King. And it finishes with us entering heaven and we sit with him. So just a quick overview to give a sense of the poem. It's prayerful with repeating rhythms and words and ideas with a lot of intense personal emotion. Some of it is expressing longing, but most expressing joy and rapture. The words sweet or images of sweetness appear again and again, as do expressions of intimate, innocent love. I've enjoyed examining it. My Latin has become rusty over the years, but it's a very readable text with a little bit of technological help. And it brings to mind what happy places monasteries and convents must have been. Peaceful, tranquil, ordered and yet timeless. Places of simple living, but in a safe, supportive environment. A sanctuary. It would have been a very meaningful life. Helping and tending to others, gardening, teaching, reading, writing, and rebuilding civilization. And also singing and chanting. Above all, they would have been joyful places, where one could lead a life of deep spiritual satisfaction and fellowship. You don't hear stories of people queuing up to leave. Ray Palmer's translation, Jesus, thou joy of loving hearts, is the other very well-known translation of this poem. Ray Palmer was a celebrated US hymn writer in his day. He was a pastor in the Congregational Church, a Protestant church with roots in the Puritan movement, so as far from St Bernard's Catholicism as you can get. Palmer's is not a literal translation. He describes it as from the Latin, but it's very singable and a lovely hymn. Jesus, thou joy of loving hearts, thou font of life, thou light of men, from the best bliss that earth imparts, we turn unfilled to thee again. This verse doesn't match to specific stanzas of St Bernard's poem, but it captures the rapturous tone and some of the imagery very nicely. Ray Palmer's verse 2 is a translation of St Bernard's verse 3, which we looked at in part A, especially these 3 lines. Thou savest those that on thee call, to them that seek thee, thou art good, to them that find thee, all in all. So that was the Quam pius et petentibus part of the poem. And here's Ray Palmer's verse 3. We taste thee, O thou living bread, and long to feast upon thee still. We drink of thee, the fountainhead, and thirst our souls from thee to fill. Again, you can't point to any specific stanza the verse might come from, but it is very close to the imagery and tone of St Bernard's long poem. St Bernard uses a lot of food images, although surprisingly, that poem doesn't actually mention bread. And here's one more stanza for comparison. It's from stanza 21 of the long poem. Jesu summa benignitas, mira cordus iacunditas, incomprehense bonitas, tua me stringit caritas. O Jesus, summit benevolent, wonderful of the heart, delight, incomprehensible goodness. So your, me, it binds love. Your love binds me. And here's Ray Palmer's verse 4. Our restless spirits yearn for thee, where'er our changeful lot is cast. Glad when thy gracious smile we see, blessed when our faith can hold thee fast. So here he translates the idea of Christ's love binding us, and there's yearning and Jesus' presence, but still a fairly loose translation. So Ray Palmer uses imagery and ideas from here and there in the Latin poem, with some bits of direct translation, but I do think he captures the tone extremely well. The hymn has a beautiful singable rhythm with a single idea in each 8-syllable line. The grammar is simple and clear, and for Latin, St Bernard's poem is quite simple in its grammar, and overall the feeling of Ray Palmer's hymn is very similar to St Bernard's poem, even though it's much more of a paraphrase than Edward Caswell's one. It's a different kind of translation to Edward Caswell, but also extremely good. Let's have a short musical interlude. That was St Agnes by John Bacchus Dykes, often paired with the Edward Caswell translation we looked at in Part A. In Part A we listened to Heber, a tune paired with the text, Jesus the very thought of thee, in a number of 19th century US hymn books, although Ray Palmer's hymn has the same metre and poetic rhythm, so a tune for one would easily suit the other. There is no single typical pairing of these texts with specific tunes, which is actually quite normal for many hymns. Strong pairings are not all that common between hymn texts and tunes, but in modern hymn books there are several tunes that are often paired with one or other of Ray Palmer's or Edward Caswell's texts. One of the fairly strong pairings is H.P. Smith's tune Meryton, but I'm saving that tune for an episode about a different writer. And there are two other tunes, including St Agnes, which were composed in the 19th century, which are reasonably often used with one or the other text. These two tunes from John Bacchus Dykes and Henry Baler are both very good, but they were perhaps a little too musically daring for their time. They are similar in many respects, and each one uses a charming oscillation between dissonance and consonance. These two very talented Englishmen were friends. John Bacchus Dykes is one of the great names in hymn tune composition. His most famous tune is probably Holy, 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 but he wrote many lovely tunes. And Henry Williams Baker was more of a hymn text writer, but he is known for a few tunes as well. So here I want to look at a tune which these days is often paired with Ray Palmer's Jesus Thou Joy of Loving Hearts. Henry Baker wrote it as a young man for no particular text and called it Hesperus, but these days it's called Quebec. And it's the tune I started this part of the episode with. So let's look at Quebec, and in particular how the inner voices work. Inner voices is a good metaphor, and a very real one. The inner world we experience as humans, the world of thoughts and emotions, our inner voices, are often subliminal, and inner voices in music, or more accurately the voices other than the melody, those that move beneath the surface or beneath the melody, creating the harmony and consisting of melodies or counter-melodies themselves, are usually felt and perceived subliminally too. Quebec, by the way, is a perfect tune for this text, despite not having been written for it or paired with it until the 20th century. The gentle, even rhythm of the tune perfectly fits the rhythm of the text, and although it wasn't based on plain chant, its slow melody and subtle harmony suits the prayerful quality of the text. A quick bit of revision: a typical vocal harmony, and almost every tune in a traditional hymn book consists of 4 voices. Soprano at the top, alto below that. These two are sometimes called the women's voices and can be written together on the treble clef. Then on the bass clef, there's bass at the bottom, and above that, the tenor. These might be called the men's voices, although a lot of women in choirs these days sing the tenor line. Quebec features a technique used in a lot of hymn tunes, small changes in one voice, creating little shifts of tension with the melody. In Quebec, this is mainly between the soprano and alto lines, with the men's voices, so to speak, in the bass clef completing the chord. I want to mention one other thing, which I will discuss further in another episode, which is that the most restful or consonant voicing for a major or minor chord, especially in a choir, is the one that has the root note in the bass, then the fifth, then the third. Quebec starts with this very gentle voicing. Then look at how the 2 voices fit together. The alto line only uses 2 notes until bar 13, very slowly moving, mostly oblique to the soprano melody. Oblique movement describes when one voice stays on one note while the other moves. It can be a lovely effect, and it's an excellent way to write for voices if you want to hit a difficult harmony, like a dissonance, and have the voices come in perfectly in pitch. In the first phrase with these 2 vocal lines, there's a stillness with very gentle tension. Here we have thirds and fifths, which are consonants, and then a fleeting interval of a second, a dissonance. In the second phrase, against the sopranos, there's a fourth. This is not a dissonance, but it nearly is one. It's a slightly difficult interval when sung. And the altos are singing the 7th compared to the bass singing the root note, the 1. So both the basses and the sopranos reach their note by a step of a whole tone, like the gap between do and re, which is the easiest interval to sing. So a choir could sing this slight dissonance perfectly. Thus, although the harmony has some tension, they can be relaxed and hit the harmony perfectly. This is good voice writing. Henry Baker is combining tension with stillness. Similarly, the dissonances in bar 10 with the F7 chord are reached by a step. And here at the end, the descending chromatic line against a steady G in the melody, which again makes it easier. If both voices were moving, that would be very hard to sing. Then in the next bar, the bass falls a fifth, also an easy interval to sing, making the stationary G now a major 7th, which is a dissonance. Then it's the soprano's turn to step down. Major 7th, 6th, 5th, against the bass. It's a very beautiful little melodic sequence. While the tenor, that little increase in movement at the end against the stillness that preceded it, gives a nice subtle contrast to mark the last line of the verse. Henry Baker is known more as a hymn text writer than a composer, and this is an early tune for him, but this is very good voice writing for a hymn. The effect is beautiful, and it's written in such a way that an amateur choir could do a good job of it. With these effects, Henry Baker's Quebec achieves what I would call meditative simplicity. This has often been a goal of hymn music, and there are many hymns that do this. It's in the nature of hymn music. Episode 3, which was about the Scottish Psalter of 1635, had a number of tunes I think of as specifically meditative, and we heard one of these as an instrumental at the start of Part A. These also use very slowly changing harmonies. So here's another hymn text set to one of these tunes called The King's Tone. We sinners, Lord, with earnest heart, with sighs and prayers and tears, to The text used in that hymn is Jesus, Our Fainting Spirit's Cry by R.P. Dunn. One more poetic translation, just a short one. Like Edward Caswell, this is more of a translation than a paraphrase. Jesus, our fainting spirit's cry, when wilt thou show thy face? Oh, when our longing satisfy, and fill us with thy grace. This is a translation of stanza 19 in Jesu Dulcis Memoria. Desiderate millies. Desire, thousands. It's odd grammar here, it's a little bit ambiguous. Mi Jesu quando venies. Oh, my Jesus, when do you come? Quando me laetum facies. When me glad do you make? Me de te quando saties. Me of you, when do you satisfy? So I have 1,000 longings. Jesus, when will you come? When will you make me glad? When will you satisfy me of thee? Verse 2 of R.P. Dunn's hymn, We sinners, Lord, with earnest hearts, with sighs and prayers and tears, to Thee our inmost cares impart, our burdens and our fears. So verse 2 is a translation of stanza 23, the same one John Henry Newman used. My most beloved Jesus, the hope of a sighing soul, pious tears seek you. Te querunt piae lacrimae, and the cries of the inmost mind, et clamor mentis intimae. R.P. Dunn then uses part of the end of St Bernard's long poem for his final verses, such as this stanza. Around thy Father's throne on high, all heaven thy glory sings, and earth, for which thou camest to die, loud with thy praises sings. You have the Latin, te caeli chorus praedicat. You of heaven, the chorus, it praises, et tuas laudes repliat, and your praises it repeats. Jesus orbem laetificat. Jesus, the globe, the orb, he delights, et nos Deo pacificat, and us to God he pacifies, which R.P. Dunn translates as, let our wanderings end and our spirits rest in thee. It's an artistic translation, although it doesn't capture the happy tone of St Bernard. Instead, it has the sort of sadness you often find in 19th century hymns. I like St Bernard's amazing medieval optimism, but poets, even when translating, are right to convey the emotions that they feel. Anyway, let's end this episode with a little bit of Ray Palmer's lovely paraphrase set to Henry Baker's music.
Jesus, the joy of loving hearts, true source of life and light of men, from the best bliss that earth imparts, we turn unfilled to you again. Our restless spirits long for you, whichever way our lot is cast, glad when your gracious smile we view, blessed when our faith can hold you fast. Jesus forever with us stay. Make all our moments calm and bright. Chase the dark night of sin away. Spread through the world your holy light.
That's a wonderful text and a lovely tune. Sorry I'm not a better singer. I hope you've enjoyed this little exploration of a few fragments of the great medieval Christian thinker St Bernard of Clairvaux, and a few of the hymns and tunes his works have inspired. There are more tunes and translations, and like the ones from this episode, they were all inspired by a wish to keep alive and add to the great mission of so many centuries past of loving and praising the Lord. Praise be to God.